Hello everyone, and welcome to our final week of lectures in this class. This week we're going to be talking about two closely related concepts, democracy and freedom, and then you'll find a short video where I wrap up the course and share my impressions with you, and apologize for things that went wrong. But let's focus on today's topic first, democracy. So democracy is the most popular model of political authority in the contemporary West, the West here being the United States and most of Western Europe. And in fact, in the book that we've been reading, this political philosophy text, the author, being from a Western democracy, pretty much just assumes that we're all on board with the democratic project. Now, historically, this hasn't been true. If you look, for instance, at around the time of the Athenians, right, Athens is going to be one of the first democracies, they were widely mocked for this idea. And in fact, one of the less polite terms that was used to refer to democracy at earlier periods in history is ochlocracy, or mob rule. The idea being that if you let the people govern themselves, you're just letting a bunch of fools make decisions, right? This is connected to a somewhat low view of the average man and what they're capable of. It's also worth noting that when we talk about a democracy, and we talk about it historically, what democracy means today is very different from what it meant back then. And in fact, very different from what it meant only 100 or 200 years ago. Democracy has evolved as a concept, become something of a universal human participation in government. But when it originated, it usually referred to a specific class of citizenry. For instance, something like wealthy landowning males. That's a pretty standard definition you see across the world, until recently, as dominating which people get to have a say in a democratic society. However, the modern democracy, the one that is probably the most popular form of government in the West, actually not just probably, definitely the most popular form of government in the West, is one in which all adults, with a few qualifications, things like, well, maybe convicts, right? Felons don't get to do that, don't get to vote or what have you, but all adults get to participate equally in the political project. This is based off of two basic assumptions, both of which might be challenged. The first is that there are no natural hierarchies. That is, nobody is by nature better than anyone else. So all hierarchies, all differences in authority have to be justified. Now note that this is going to be in direct contradiction of some classical views about human nature, that there are different kinds of people. Say the caste system present in classical Hinduism, or Aristotle, who believed that, essentially, only men were capable, adult men specifically, capable of living a full life of virtue. Women could understand reason, by his view, but couldn't act in accordance with it. This is where you see the beginning of a pernicious myth in the West, that women are irrational. A lot of that falls on Aristotle. At the very least, he codified it and brought it together in a way that made it a sort of an assumption of decades going forwards, of centuries going forwards, and is only just now starting to have its harmful effects addressed in society. So this is the first assumption. There are no natural hierarchies. This is a significant assumption. As we can see, there are groups of people throughout history who disagree with this. The other assumption of democracy is that the people are the best guardians of their own interests. That is, if we want to know who can take care of the people best, it's the people themselves. Again, this is going to be a contentious point. Throughout history, you've had this idea of sort of technocrats, experts who are in charge of us for our own good. A good example would be a parent and a child. Children are not the best guardians of their own interests. If you ask a kid what they want for dinner, there's probably going to be ice cream and candy, right? That's not good for them. The people who we trust to be the guardians of their interests, then, are their parents. And historically, there are views, political views, that account something to this effect. That is, the government is supposed to have the same relationship with the people as parents do with their children. This is called, not coincidentally, paternalism, though usually that term has a negative connotation. It's especially common within the feminist movement. But this idea that the government, or society as a whole, is supposed to make decisions for you. However, there are some regards in which this is relatively sensible. I probably should not be making decisions for myself regarding what medicines are on the market, what chemicals I put into my body. I know a fair amount about nutrition and biology and that sort of thing. I know, your average amount, which is to say, not very much. When it gets to things like evaluating the toxicity of a chemical, whether or not this thing is going to kill me, I don't really know. I'm probably going to count on someone. Luckily, we have the FDA to tell us that sort of stuff. Criticisms of the FDA aside for now. So this is the general idea of democracy, and its two major assumptions, right? So this general idea of all adult citizens participate in the government, all with an asterisk, right? Cutting out felons, cutting out whoever else doesn't qualify, because there is no difference between people unless the people decide upon it, right? So you're not qualified to rule over me unless I give you that permission. And that the people, us, are the best guardians of our own interests. Now, both of these assumptions, as we pointed out, are troublesome. But since that's not the direction the book goes in, which is unfortunate, I think it'd be interesting to investigate these principles more thoroughly, let's take a closer look at democracy itself. So there are two models of democracy we're going to be looking at here, two models that are common in the world. Well, actually, only one of them is common. The other one is something of an ideal that certain people, including the author of this text, believes should be implemented. And the two kinds are representative democracy and direct democracy. Representative democracy is essentially all modern democracies. These also sometimes go by the names of republics, though I think there is some technical differences. It's a very nuanced distinction. Essentially, representative democracy and republic are coextensive. There are a few tricks, but nothing we need to get into right now, that would distinguish them in some cases, but it's not terribly important. All modern democracies are representative democracies, or almost all. And in a representative democracy, you would elect a representative, a congressperson, a parliamentary representative, right? Someone who is going to go forward and represent your interests to the government and to other governments. Now, this has a nice structure to it in a sense. And there's a lot of reasons that representative democracies are valued both historically and in the present. They're easier to track, right? So it's just easier to keep track of 100 representatives than it is 100,000 people, right? It's going to be easier to ask Congress what they want than ask all of America what they want. Also, there can be some sort of representation by experts. I can say something to the effect of, well, look, I don't know much about medicine, but I know somebody who does, my doctor. So I want to have my doctor represent me in this panel that's making decisions about medicine. In this way, we can avoid the sort of criticism that the people may not have technical expertise, which is relevant. On the negative side, we surrender personal authority in this regard, right? Yes, you're democratic, but you're democratic once every 2 years, right? When a new candidate comes up, and then you vote, and then you cease to be a democracy again, right? You're just ruled again, you're governed again, and you don't actually have any impact on the legislative process at the time. And alternatively, there may not be much of a difference between us and the experts. And we'll get to some reasons for thinking about this when we look at the challenges of political decision-making or political judgment in context of a democracy. But the main thrust here is if you look at Congress, for instance, the American Congress, the United States Congress, almost all of them have education in law. There's a surprisingly large number who have other fields of education. But when they're making laws governing medicine, there's not that many doctors. When they're making laws governing science, right, education, they, generally speaking, don't have the expertise for every field they're going to govern for. And it's not clear that, generally speaking, they have more expertise than the average American does. So that's our representative democracy, and that's what we're used to. Let's look at this alternative idea now, this direct democracy, and see what that would look like. So a direct democracy is one in which each person directly participates in government traditions. Ignore the word traditions there. Each person directly participates in government decisions. So when it comes time to decide how we're going to be taxed, everyone gets on their phone and votes, right? Obvious benefits of this, everybody is involved all the time. For instance, right, so we don't have to deal with this thing where okay, well, I've elected my congressperson, and now they rule over me for 2 years. Because every time there's a decision to be made, to make that decision. It also helps keep the people's interest in focus. It's going to be much harder, in fact, probably impossible, for there to be congressional corruption, right? You can't have somebody who's taking bribes under the table in Congress, right? As this is something that has happened throughout history and probably happens today, right? Certain political officials have their views adjusted by large donations. That's harder to do, at least, with a direct democracy, because everybody is making this decision. One major con here is that it's potentially unwieldy. It's a lot of people to keep track of. Hundreds of millions of people you have to tally their vote on for everything. Other problems that we might face with direct democracy are things like if we're suspicious about the qualifications of the masses. So we could be worried about things like social movements. I mean, look what happened when we asked the internet to name a boat, and they went right to Boaty McBoatface. That's not super inspiring, and that doesn't exactly inspire confidence in the capacity of large groups of people to make good decisions. In fact, what we've seen is that one person starts sort of leading a charge, and people will sort of file in after them. So there's another reason we might be worried about direct democracy. But these are the two standards of democracy that we have to choose between when we establish our governments. And usually we end up somewhere in between, like usually a pretty representative republic, a representative democracy, with a little bit of direct democracy, things like ballot issues, that sort of thing. So this is one question we need to ask ourselves when we consider being a democratic society, which is, what kind of democracy are we going for? Now, direct democracy, which used to have severe limitations, things like, well, how are you going to gather everyone's vote? Some people have pointed out that new technology makes this more plausible. We can poll the entire American populace in a day if we wanted to, or almost entire American populace. There'd be some groups out there. All we have to do is do a push notification to your phone, and I bet 80% of the United States would be in right away. But that may not resolve more serious challenges about the decision-making abilities of the populace at large. However, if we start to doubt that, we are now doubting one of the basic tenets of democracy, which is that the people are the guardians of their own best interest, or the best guardians of their own best interest. So that's something to think about. If you become suspicious that the people as a whole would start making really bad decisions, and I think there is good reason to be suspicious of that, then you might need to be suspicious about the democratic project as a whole, which has some interesting consequences. We can think about the democratic project as an attempt to answer who is best qualified to make political judgments. And your book points out that there are at least three factors involved. Factual information regarding the consequences, the nature of the field being discussed. So things like when you're making a decision about medicine, when I talked about not wanting to be the one in charge of determining whether or not a chemical was toxic for me, right, because I don't have that expertise. What I'm appealing to here is that I lack factual information here, that I want an expert to make it for me. The next is going to be like the values of the people. So what do the people want? And then finally, considerations of fairness. Now, your book, and our book rather, argues that in all of these things, the people, the democratic body, is equally qualified as the elected representatives. I think there are some reasons to be suspicious of this. The first is that, so factual information. This might be true in a very well-educated society. However, while, for instance, our congresspeople are most, lawyers, right, what have you, they're still most cases better educated than us. They may not have specialty knowledge, but they at least have better general knowledge than we do. Now, ideally, we would have expert groups who make these decisions, and that's why we make groups like the FDA. But it is still possible that they have better access to factual information than we do. Another case where this might come up is if we're dealing with secret information, that is, top secret or classified information. You can't really deal with that in a direct democracy in an effective way. Because if everyone has access to it, it's not secret anymore. And if not everyone has access to it, then people are missing vital information. Importantly, the people making the decisions are missing vital information. The values of the people. Presumably, actually, I think if you just polled everyone, that's pretty much what you do to find that out. So that's probably something that the people are actually better at than Congress, right? Because they're going to know what you want, right? You know what you value. You know how to check which box you want. And if we all do that, then yeah, we're fine. Considerations of fairness, I think, is going to be roughly an even split, and that's what your book suggests as well, I believe, between who is more capable. That is, both parties, both individuals and our representatives, are going to be about even on figuring out whether something is fair. However, there's one reason we might like the representative system more here, which is to say that if you look at a large population, let's say I represent the state, right, the state of New York. It's a large population. I need to consider fairness for everyone within it. Because of that, I might be more attuned to certain considerations that wouldn't really come up to us, right? So if we just live in New York City and we're looking at these rules, well, we're probably not going to think about things of, wait, what if some people don't have access to internet, right? Which is not an uncommon problem in rural environments. Right. So there might be certain considerations of fairness, certain facts that are important that we might miss out on just as individuals. However, I think the idea here, though, is with everyone acting in their own self-interest to some extent, we all sort of accumulate to a fair point, but I'm suspicious of that. This connects to a critical issue for democracy as a whole, which is how do you balance preferences when people disagree? Well, one thing we want to catch on to is there's a difference between the strength of a preference and the number of a preference. Take, for instance, Judaism. Judaism is a small religion. About 14 million Jews in the world, I think, last I counted. Anyway, last time I looked at the data. It's a very small religion. Something like very near to half the Jews in the world live in and around New York. Surprisingly close to that. So if we were to look at a law that would explicitly ban Judaism, right, as a religion you could practice, well, there aren't going to be a lot of people who would be affected by that, but they'll be affected very strongly. Right? So this is one thing we need to pay attention to when we pay attention to preferences. Right? Certain people are impacted more significantly by decisions we make than others. More realistic instances, when we think about things like eminent domain, where the government can seize property to engage in projects for the public good, well, somebody's going to be really influenced by that, the person whose property you're seizing. Now, you're going to be paid back, but they're still taking your property. The rest of us, however, aren't really going to be impacted by that. Right? So I might even have a preference. Oh, that sounds unfortunate, but the strength of my preference is nothing equivalent to theirs. So this is one trick we have, one challenge we have when we deal with democracies, which is that we are probably better at counting numbers of preferences than strengths, but I can poll everybody. But unless I develop a way to detect carefully how much people care, then it's going to be harder to tell if I'm risking essentially overriding a sacred value of one small group for the sake of reinforcing a value of a larger group. And this connects to the real problem for democracy, in my view, which is the protection of minority groups, especially intense and persistent minorities. That is, groups that are very small and groups that will remain minorities. Again, the Jewish population is a fine example of this. Right? Judaism is an intense minority because it is a very small religion compared to other major religions, both in the world and in the United States. It is also a persistent minority in that there isn't any reason, at least, to believe that the religious makeup of the world or of the United States is going to radically shift such that it is not a minority tomorrow. Contrast this to something like, 40% of us want to go out to pizza and 60% want to go out to Chinese. Well, 40% to 60, that's a minority, but it's not a very big gap. And likewise, those sorts of desires change day to day. So it's probably not a persistent minority either. So there are a couple of ways that minorities can try to pursue their interests in a public discourse in democracy, in a democratic discourse. One is through lobbying or pluralist coalitions. So lobbying is you send a representative, someone to your representative, or to the people as a whole, right? They go on television and they make these ads. Or these pluralist coalitions where, the Jewish community and the Sikh community and the Hindu community all gather together, even though Hinduism is actually a very large faith both in the world and in the United States. It's the fourth largest in the US, I think. Right. So we all gather together, though, and we decide we have shared interests here in that we don't want this one particular group to make a certain law. Now, this is somewhat effective, but this gives an advantage to organized groups and a disadvantage to disorganized groups, which means that already it's giving the advantage to economically well-off groups, primarily because money gives you organization and gives you power and gives you speech in a special way here. So there's going to be a big advantage to these groups in getting their voices heard that the rest of us won't have, and that's problematic. Another thing we might do then, so we don't want these groups to just run wild and knock over everybody else, because if you don't have any sort of protection for minorities in your democracy, they just don't get to do anything, right? Democracy is majority rule. So once the majority decides, it's decided. And that seems problematic in some cases, right? That seems problematic in cases of, for instance, religious intolerance. So what you might do then is instead develop minority protections. That is, special rules that protect the minorities. One instance of such might be the protection of freedom of religion in the United States. Right? Yes, we acknowledge that these are small groups. However, we have agreed together on a specific law that says we're not allowed to override that group just because they're a minority. Now, one problem for these is that it's actually hard to get majorities to agree to these without the belief that they could become a minority. And that might be true for many groups, but often isn't, right? Many groups either don't perceive themselves as it being possible for them to become minorities, or realistically won't be, right? Christianity is probably not going to be a minority in America for quite some time, if ever. So minority protections are useful when they can be established, but they are difficult to establish. And even when established, they are up for negotiation and interpretation. And the way that the majority interprets the regulations that they've essentially put on themselves can change over time. Look at all the various debates that are happening regarding things like the freedom of religion in the United States. Finally, we might look to subdivide our communities, allowing groups to regulate themselves so that minorities essentially don't have to worry about it. One example of this is city governments, right? Instead of having one massive federal government, we're saying, well, this city has a very particular set of interests, let it govern itself, and then let the state govern, the counties govern the region around it, the state govern the counties, up the scale, right? The whole idea here is to prevent something like, well, this rural county in Kansas has no interests shared, or almost no interests shared, with New York City. But New York City outnumbers them enormously so. So if we let New York City do things like set the tax rate for this rural county in Kansas, they're going to be insensitive to the fact that they might be bankrupting this place because they don't have that kind of money in the first place. Right. Or that public works principles that would work in one place won't work in the other. So we can break them down. Now, of course, one challenge there immediately is, well, now you've just made new minorities, right? Minorities with respect to their city government, and their county government, and their state government, and their and the federal government, right? Each level can have its own minority groups within it. But it does provide some level of protection for the minority groups. So I think this is probably the most severe problem that democracy faces, and the most serious challenge to a great extent. Well, one of them anyway, is that how do we protect minorities and minority groups and their rights when we are following a dictum of majority rules? A couple of other big questions to think about, by the way, so not just that, well, how do you protect minorities when there's majority rules? Also things like, well, is democracy really the best way to handle this? And are the people genuinely the best guardians of their own best interests? So these are things to think about as you move forward.